If ever there has been a game that evoked more emotion with less than Super Mario 64, I would be blown away. Sure, Majora's Mask had me nearly crying, and I felt powerful while destroying an enemy base in Breath of the Wild. But Majora's Mask wants you to cry. Breath of the Wild wants you to feel something powerful. But there is something inherently intriguing when a game creates emotions without telling you what those emotions should be. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The lifetime of a game is determined by the amount of time it spends in the cultural spotlight. Many games, such as those in the Call of Duty series, have a relatively short lifespan. They age poorly and rarely maintain a significant user base after the hype is over. However, there are a select few games that remain popular for long periods of time and manage to cross the line into classics. There's a point with art, television, music, and media as a whole when an entire subculture can be built around one of these items, and that subculture eventually dwarfs the piece itself. As mentioned prior, time in the spotlight is what gives a game its life. Therefore, these subcultures are integral to keeping a game alive for decades. With the exception of Undertale, Super Mario 64 has one of the most sprawling communities that is still thriving, despite the game being released almost 3 decades ago. This sort of unflinching dedication from the fans comes from a few principles that I will be discussing later in the video. In order to properly dissect Super Mario 64, or generally games of that era, we have to talk about modern art. With the exception of some outliers, modern art is generally just good math when it comes to colors and the balance of the image. There's little more to it than that. However, when that balance is perfect, we can tell quickly. For example, there's a spectacular piece of modern art that is undeniably balanced to perfection and evokes the exact same reaction in almost every viewer. Now I understand if you have not come across this piece of art before. It's only famous because the objects contained work perfectly with each other to always create a sense of balance. Did you see the balance that I described in that picture? If you did, wonderful, because you have just illustrated the point that I'm trying to make. I put those objects together at random in about 20 seconds. However, I kept the concept simple enough to put the heavy lifting of interpretation onto your brain. A work of art such as the Mona Lisa is indisputably well crafted. It's detailed and intriguing, and we all know what we're supposed to think when we look at it. With modern art, however, our brain is left to do most of the interpretation. Therefore, if I give a little bit of set dressing by telling you it's a fantastic piece, it forces your brain to attempt to assign meaning to the composition, or in this case, lack thereof. Games such as Mario 64 utilize the same concept. Our brains will always attempt to fill a blank canvas. Minimalism in games is the equivalent of a blank canvas. Use the game to provide the aforementioned set dressing and direct the player slightly, but make sure that you are activating their creativity to assign more meaning to the game. How is this achieved? Well, to explain, I'll give you an example. How many times when playing Call of Duty Black Ops did one of your friends tell you that they saw Wario's head appear, or ask you where the image of the skybox came from? When was the last time they showed you one of these for Call of Duty Black Ops? It's nowhere near as common, and that's because the game tells you exactly what to think and what to expect. The game loop is predictable and polished. There's no room for surprises. In contrast, Mario 64 is raw, it's glitchy, and it feels like you catch a glimpse of things the developers never intended for you to see. This is where the game gets its flavor. This is what encourages players to ascribe meaning to the meaningless. Every door you enter has you questioning whether or not you're experiencing what was directly intended by the devs, or if you've just broken the game further and you're witnessing something that almost no one has seen. Now, this is not me advising you to go make a game that plays like you turned on every cheat in the Game Shark at once, but I'm simply illustrating a point. Returning to the quote from the beginning of the video, if we do not feel something, if it does not emotionally register with us, we forget about it. What better way to make sure that it emotionally registers with the player than to have them create the fantasy themselves? Yes, the end goal is to defeat Bowser and rescue Peach, but is that the primary focus of the game? How does that end goal explain this drowning city in the corner of a painting? How does it explain a carousel in the bottom of a mansion inside a miniature birdcage that fell out of a boo in an obscure passageway in the back of the castle? The short answer is, it doesn't. We are the ones that have to explain that for ourselves. The long answer is, this is also not me advising you to go make a game with no content and force a player to assign it meaning. Think of it as someone dropping you out in the middle of a field and telling you to build a house. There's no fun in that. However, what if they dropped you out in the middle of the field with building supplies? They're not telling you what specifically to build, but you know what materials you have to work with. It provides limitations so that your mind has a starting point to work from. Maybe they want the game to be a horror game. Maybe they want the game to be a speedrun. Maybe they want...
Thank you so much for playing my game.
This means that we must strike a balance between the player interpretation and the game's story, well, still existing. The more real you can convince someone your game world is, the more effectively you can communicate your story and keep the game in their minds. This doesn't mean that your game has to use realistic physics or amazing graphics or familiar environments and life forms. Realism is based on relatability. A game can have a fantasy setting and unfamiliar creatures, but if the story arc can be compared to an experience that we've had, the game still has meaning or realism. Realism comes from characters acting broken and the world not being built to cradle the player. For example, Skyward Sword's level design is clearly fake. There are perfectly spaced platforms to jump from, and the levels are clearly built to guide the player in the right direction. Breath of the Wild, however, is far more subtle. The tutorial for that game is a great plateau, and after that, the game doesn't really tell you what to do. And that is realism, not the graphics or the perfect physics, but the lack of forceful guidance. You can craft your experience in the game. You interpret the meaning of the game. You interpret the meaning of, shh, walk quietly in the hallway. Super Mario 64 has a file size of 8 megabytes. A brand new player will probably beat the game in around 12 hours, while a speedrunner can beat it in under 7 minutes. TAS, or Tool Assisted Speedrunning, has shown that a time of 420 is even possible. The game was developed in a year, and the first 6 months of development were spent on one stage before the devs remembered, oh yeah, we should probably start working on the other 31 stages that we have planned. To say the game's development was rushed would be an understatement. To say that the rushed development aided the game's endurance and popularity would also be an understatement. Nintendo has occasionally had problems with over-polishing games, getting every action and world perfect until there's no personality left whatsoever. This is not the case with Mario 64. Mario 64 is raw, it's unpolished and almost entirely unpresentable. It rarely directs you in any direction and constantly has outcomes that feel unwanted from the devs. So, is it weird for me to say that that's what makes it real? It certainly feels more real than the world of Super Mario 3D World, but speculation of what feels real is relatively useless. Real is such a loosely defined term when it comes to game development that just saying something feels real is not enough. The realism of Mario 64 comes from the entropy that I mentioned prior. The game is sufficiently loose with the world that it creates a sense of wonder at what might be around the next corner. You can really imagine anything. This is where the iceberg image draws its intrigue. Many items on the list are entirely fabricated, and yet they are all somehow believable. That is, well, until someone goes through the code for the game and has to spoil it for the rest of us by finding out that it isn't even remotely possible. But it speaks to player engagement when they want to fantasize, and they want to believe that there's more to this game than most people realize. And the player will find things that they didn't know were possible all throughout the game. 120 stars are possible to collect in this game, and each of them require the player to use various skills that he learns. However, it is possible to go much of the game without knowing that you can long jump or backflip, or be. The game never forces a tutorial on you. There's never an info dump where all the lore is given to you. The game simply lets you discover all that for yourself. There's no map, there aren't characters littered about the level to give you advice. Pretty much all you have is just one phrase to direct you to the star. In fact, the levels rarely even change from star to star, so I often found myself getting the 3rd, or 4th, or 5th, or 6th star before I finally found the first one. That lack of guidance in a game presents a far more realistic experience. Now obviously you can't frustrate the player by never telling them what to do, but do let go of their hands once in a while. Give them room to breathe and room to enjoy the game that you built for them. Since this game's release, titles have been recycling the groundwork that was laid by this game, recreating the movement and the texturing, and this game is probably still considered the father of 3D platformers. Now, I had mentioned Nintendo's habit of over-polishing a game to the point that it loses what made the idea special in the first place. However, my analysis wasn't complete. Media as a whole really has become lazy. We see artists releasing deluxe versions of old albums for more popularity, reusing and copying the same formula to build each song, movies careful not to have any plot points that might be interesting and instead focus on pushing their agenda, and video games even becoming a grab for the best photo scan and motion capture team. I think it's ironic that in our modern society we're so obsessed with taking real-life motions and putting them into video games and even scanning in our real-world objects, but in that process we lose what made the games real in the first place. Because in the end, the real game is never the one with the perfect graphics or the most awe-inspiring physics, because people don't come to these games to see the latest technology, but they come to put themselves in another world. They come to imagine. So then, real becomes the game where the player, the human in front of the screen, attributes the most meaning themselves. After all, artists only splashes and strokes without someone to look at it, and without a player, well, a game is no more than 8 megabytes in a cartridge.